My plan was initially just to jump right into the nature of the research your organisation has been doing, but I'm going to fall back to what I normally do in my radio program, which is get your backstory, which I've finally been sort of fully filled in on, in us just talking backstage. Many people would assume that perhaps you being a successful doctor, surgeon, that you would come from a privileged background, James. That's not quite right, is it?
Well, privilege sometimes is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it?
You're not a rich kid, is what I'm saying.
No. So to go back to my backstory, actually I grew up in poverty. Neither of my parents had gone to college. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an invalid. And in fact, in my entire life at home, we were actually on public assistance.
So you grew up in this environment which I suppose expectations of you would not be high. There's a certain way of looking at kids from this background, like you're not going to ever turn out to be any good, are you?
Well, you know, what is particularly sad, and I think many of you probably know this attending this conference, oftentimes people live up to an expectation, and if they're not given an expectation, they don't strive to live up to that. But I think that's exactly right.
There was one day, though, when you were, 13 years old, and you walked into a magic shop. Tell me about that day.
So, in my particular situation, you know, when you grow up in this environment, and I describe it, because it's a very chaotic environment, as being a leaf blown by an ill wind. You know, you have no control, you don't know what's going to happen next, and it's demoralizing. And when you wake up every day and you don't have hope, what happens to children in this environment? Oftentimes they give up, right? Or they start engaging in negative behaviors because they're trying to diminish the pain that they have. So interestingly, what happened to me was that I was on my bicycle and I saw a magic shop at a strip mall, and I went in because I actually didn't have anything else to do that day. And the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And she knew nothing about magic. But I engaged in a conversation with her, and after a few minutes, she said to me, you know, I really like you. And she's one of these people who, and I'm sure all of you have met them, you sense that they have a very open heart. And they embrace you regardless of who you are. And it's an extraordinary interaction, isn't it? So this woman said, you know, if you come here every day for the next 6 weeks, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life. And so I showed up. And what she taught me actually was a mindfulness practice, intertwined with the visualization technique, the power of positive thinking. And it had a profound impact in my life. And in fact, we talk about neuroplasticity. My brain changed during that interaction. It changed from having a sense that I had no opportunity or no potential to having a perception that I had unlimited.
Why were you open to that, do you think, James? Because you're 13 years old, you're a troubled family home that would probably create a situation of consistent low-level anxiety, I suppose, in that situation.
That hasn't changed.
That hasn't changed. In fact, right now. So why do you think you were prepared to, as a 13-year-old boy, listen to a woman who says, I want to teach you a meditative practice?
Well, I think the reality, it wasn't so much the meditative practice, to be frank with you. It was the fact, and this is something we cannot forget, it is the fact that someone with an open heart reaches out to you. And that is why I listened.
What became available to you? What inner resources were unleashed? Is that the word I'm looking for? Or what inner resources grew out of that practice over time?
Well, you know, it was interesting because she gave me exercises, and I actually did them religiously. And what I found was the language that I would listen to, which I think is present for a lot of people, is this negative dialogue you have with yourself. How do you get over this negative dialogue that says you're not good enough, you're not talented enough, you have no right to do X, Y, or Z. How do you silence that and change it around to sit there and say, you can do anything you choose to do? And that was the gift that she gave me, was to stop that dialogue and recognize, number one, that in some sense every one of us is suffering and is in the exact same boat, maybe in a different way, but fundamentally all of these issues are issues that all of us are dealing with. And it allowed me to stop that dialogue, become focused, and set a set of goals. And it's interesting because, you know, the standard trajectory, as an example, to go to college, to medical school, if you're fluent at least, it's fairly straightforward. You study hard, you have the environment that maximizes your ability to succeed, and you go onward. With these techniques she taught me, I was able to achieve these things, but believe me, it was not a straight line. It was a very circuitous line. But it doesn't really matter. It only matters that you got there, and that's really the key.
How did you get into medical school? How were your grades?
Well, so there's an interesting story. You know, having nobody who went to college in my family, I actually didn't even know about the process, but I knew I wanted to go to college. And in fact, I had been inspired by hearing a doctor talk. And I said, that's what I want to do. I want to care for people. But I had no resources or even understanding of this. And the way I even applied to college was there's a girl in my class who was actually filling out an application, and I asked her what she was doing. She said, I'm applying to college. I said, oh, really? I said, where are you going? And she told me, and I said, well, that's where I'm going. And she had an extra application, and that's the only application I filled out.
What if you hadn't been sitting next to her that day?
Well, she was pretty good looking, so I think
it was always going to happen.
But the interesting story about that is, you know, imagine you come to college, you're completely ill-prepared for it, and then I'm having to leave repeatedly to deal with family issues. You know, get my father out of jail. You know, deal with my mother who's attempted suicide for the third or fourth time. So when I applied to medical school, my GPA was 2.53 out of 4. The average GPA in the US at that time to get into medical school was 3.76. Now, by every criterion, I was not a candidate to go to medical school. And it's interesting, at my university, there was a pre-med committee, and you had to actually apply to them to give you a letter. So I went to apply to them. And do you know what they were kind enough to tell me? Don't waste our time. Can you imagine? Don't waste our time. You know, something that's even worse than somebody not liking you is dismissing you, isn't it? Yeah. They don't even care enough. Well, at 19 years of age, I told them that was unacceptable. And I demanded to be interviewed by these people. And I walk into a room, and the dean of the School of Biological Sciences was so impressed that he showed up himself. And you can imagine how pleasant it is to walk into a room and have 3 people sitting there like this. So what I did was I lectured them for an hour. And I lectured them on what right did they have to destroy people's dreams?
You're doing that at the age of 19, are you?
There was not one bit of evidence that shows beyond a certain minimal level of IQ and being a smart young man or woman that you will succeed in medical school. So after our little discussion, which was primarily one-sided, they were actually all crying. And they were actually kind enough to give me the strongest recommendation they could. So now the question is, though, even with that recommendation, getting into medical school, it doesn't matter what your recommendation is, you still have a 2.53 GPA. So the other incredible thing that happened was as I was leaving that meeting, I saw a brochure. And remember, I came from this poor background, and this brochure advertised a summer enrichment program at a medical school for people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So I got this brochure, and I didn't even know such programs even existed. So I looked at this brochure, and the deadline had passed several days before. So I called the lady up, and I convinced her to let me in. And she did. And I showed up, and that's the medical school I went to. And in fact, I didn't even end up getting a degree. So they let me in with this 2.53 GPA, no undergraduate degree. And you know what? I did okay. And again, it shows you, unfortunately, not only do so many people want to create artificial criteria that limit us in what we can do, but unfortunately, the sad thing is sometimes we listen to it. And that is the most limiting thing that can happen.
Is there a process of transcendence that took place there in order to give you the confidence to harangue a dean and a bunch of other academics for an hour and to, I don't know, have that sense of self-worth and confidence to do that?
Well, you know, this was the blessing that woman in the magic shop gave me, actually. And it's interesting because I went back to thank her some period afterwards. And it was in a strip mall, this magic shop. And I went there, and there was no magic shop. In fact, there were tumbleweeds in the parking lot. And I never got to thank her. But you know, what has stayed with me in that situation and living through that experience is, first of all, you know, you can grow up and get angry about what you don't have, and that's a real easy thing to do. The best thing, though, you can do is to be thankful for what you do have. And even as a youngster, and I saw a number of individuals who were in the capacity in terms of financial position or just position in general, influential position, who were in every position possible to help me as I was growing up, or to help others who were less fortunate, and they chose not to. And the other, of course, the paradox of that is people who have nothing but give everything. And the extraordinary thing is I never felt angry about this. Actually, I felt sad for these people, because when you engage with other people in an authentic way and you show that you care about them, the gift back to you from that engagement and from that helping far surpasses anything else, and is what will stick with you in life and give you transcendence. You know, transcendence is this desire of each and every one of us to know our place in the universe, to feel that we have a connection and a purpose, to feel that we're offering benefit, and also a sense that we're all connected. And you know, we talk about mindfulness sometimes and meditation. Oftentimes, that's an inward journey. Transcendence requires an outward journey of embracing. It's embracing the unknown, it's embracing what you don't know, and it's caring for others. And the sense of what you get from that in terms of an innumerable number of health benefits, both mental and physical, are extraordinary. And in fact, that's what's led me ultimately down this path.
As you say, you did all right as a doctor. In fact, you became a neurosurgeon, which is kind of at the outer end of what's complicated in medicine at the moment. In that practice, you care for patients, and most senior doctors or surgeons that I've spoken to over the years have to practice this mix of compassion for the patient, but also detachment, because I don't know if you want a hugely emotional surgeon operating on your brain at that moment.
The answer is no.
No? No. How do you manage that?
Well, there is a perception by some people that neurosurgeons are arrogant, brusque, rude, and egotistical. And it's all true. Except for me. You know, when you deal with somebody's brain, and this is what I try to teach residents too, the interaction that I have as a physician, especially in that context, for many of those people and their families, is the most important one that they'll have in that person's life, because it means life or death in some instances. And it's not to be something that is taken for granted or lightly. I take my job very seriously. But the other side of that coin is, having compassion and the sense of caring is extraordinarily important. But neurosurgery is fundamentally a technical exercise. And you have to completely objectify that person and have no sense of connection to that person to be able to do that. I was telling Richard a story earlier. There's a woman I had met who had a large aneurysm. I don't know if you know what that is. It's this outpouching of a blood vessel in her brain. And she was an avid opera singer. And this thing was right by her speech area. And it was found by accident, but it needed to be taken care of because of the size. And over the course of conversations about when we were going to do this surgery, I became friends with her. So I took her to surgery. And again, normally I'm quite good at making that transition to objectification. But as I had this aneurysm exposed and saw that the wall was paper thin, was about to rupture, you could actually see the blood swirling, I started thinking about what would happen if I mess up, if there's a complication. And my hand started shaking. I had the aneurysm clip actually in my hand, and my hand started going like this. And I tears were actually coming into my eyes. I'm going, oh my God. So I actually had to go and sit for 15 minutes to get back into the space and then go back and finish out. And she did well, thank goodness. But you have to be completely in that place, and that doesn't involve any emotion.
You've had an interesting relationship with money over the years, having come from childhood where there was not much money at all to spare, making a very good income as a neurosurgeon. Then you became a kind of private entrepreneur, setting up, becoming the CEO of a company, finding investors for a company called CCARE, which became a $1.3 billion company, I believe.
Exactly, yeah.
You had that, you had a whole lot of other tech investments, you became an extremely wealthy man, actually, by many standards. Then there was the dot-com crash, and those stocks, except for CCARE, were wiped out.
Yeah, so I actually ended up being a fairly successful entrepreneur. And I had gotten involved in the tech thing and made tens and tens of millions of dollars, and actually was driving a really wonderful Ferrari. And I had bought a big home on the top of, it was a penthouse in a building in San Francisco with its own private elevator.
You had an island in New Zealand.
Yes, I was, yes.
The south or the north?
Yes, it was between the Marlborough Straits, actually. And I had a villa in Florence. And I was single. Not that those other things have any relationship.
No, of course
not. Yeah, and in 6 weeks I lost everything. And in fact, I was $3 million in debt. And I had to get rid of everything in about 6 weeks as well to pay back this money to the bank. So I had nothing left. Now, when I say I have nothing left, I had me left, and my worst day is I'm a neurosurgeon, so that's still a lot. But it was an interesting exercise. But the real exercise actually was what followed. Because, when you grow up in a background like I described to you, when you have chaos around you, what is it that you think you want? You want control, right? You want to feel that you can get rid of chaos in your life and that you can control external events. And if you come from poverty, you think that is manifested by having money. And the wonderful gift of those events happening, actually, was this monkey that had been on my back that was driving me to acquire these types of things, and to think that the more I got, somehow that would make me happy, was released, because everything was gone. And
sorry, can I interrupt you there? Everything wasn't gone. You had the stock in CCARE, the company you'd helped develop to become a billion-dollar company, but the problem was you'd promised to give it away to Stanford University.
And to others. Well, you know what happened? I had made a promise, not only to Stanford but other universities, and I wanted to live up to it. But I had no legal obligation to live up to it, but I said I would live up to it. So
what were your friends advising you at the time?
They said I was is this an Australian term, frigging? Frigging idiot? Is that the...
Maybe they didn't say frigging.
Well, there's an American term that's probably, it starts with the same letter.
I know, we're familiar with it in this country too.
But, you know, as you've probably seen from my background, I have my own compass about what is right and wrong, and I decided to follow that. So I gave all the stock, every bit of that stock away. And when that company ended up going public at $1.3 billion, then it would be up tens of millions of dollars that I gave away to charity. But by giving it away, it finally released me and liberated me from that sense that I had to have all these things. And, but it did wonderful things. And remember I talked about the medical school that I went to? And they let me in. I still have great sense of thankfulness. So, interestingly enough, after Hurricane Katrina, you all heard of Hurricane Katrina? So the dean became actually so depressed he quit. And the library had been devastated by the flooding. And so what happened was they were trying to recruit a new dean. Well, I was in an interesting position. So I actually endowed the dean's chair at the medical school. So the dean of this medical school is now the Doty professor. Right? The library I refurbished, and then I set up a very significant scholarship for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and students who are committed to service. But I named it actually after that woman who. So the point, though, is you can never judge what one person is capable of. And in every interaction you have, the important thing is to keep your heart open to understand that you really don't know about that person. But what you do know is that if you extend them kindness and love, it will give them the ability to reach whatever potential they have. And that's really the key. And it's what each of you want, isn't it?
James, at Stanford University in California, you set up the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. That's a really interesting name for an institution. Given that you're a neurosurgeon, which takes a kind of necessarily takes a mechanistic view of the brain and how to figure, tell me what the thrust is of that research and education at this center.
Well, you know, some people would say Stanford and compassion are oxymorons, and that because, you know, Stanford is perceived as an extraordinarily competitive place. And in fact, again, probably by every criteria, I should probably not be there, but they let me come there. But it also turns out...
You've given them so much money, that doesn't hurt either, I'm sure.
It's amazing how that works, isn't it? But yes, so I have an endowed chair there, and I've given them some money. And the reason I did, though, was it was the relationship with them, actually, and their support that actually allowed me to be a professor there, but also to run this company. So I was very appreciative and had great gratitude for that. But it's interesting because I would periodically leave Stanford to explore just other things. And oftentimes these were entrepreneurial things, but I left and came back. And when I came back, I just started engaging with scientists because I was really interested in the neural basis of compassion and its moral and social bases as well. And so I started some research projects, very preliminary, and collaborations. And then I said, it popped into my head one day, I want the Dalai Lama to come and talk at Stanford about compassion. And frankly, I am not a Buddhist. I was not a follower of the Dalai Lama. Some people call them groupies of the Dalai Lama. I wasn't at all. But I had the opportunity, though, to meet him and to talk to him about this because I wanted to come back to Stanford. So after 5 minutes, he immediately agreed to come back. He said, this is important work. And this is the first time I met him, right? And then after this, he begins, after our conversation, talking about the importance of this type of work. And as many of you know, he's very interested in neuroscience, very interested in the effects of meditation on the brain, very interested, obviously, in compassion. So he begins this animated dialogue with Thupten Jinpa, who many of you may know has been His Holiness's translator for 25 years. He has a PhD from Cambridge. At the end of this conversation, which was in Tibetan, Jim Pod turns to me, he says, Jim, His Holiness so believes in this work you're doing, he wants to make a personal donation. And he ended up making the largest donation he's ever made to a non-Tibetan cause for this work at Stanford. Isn't that extraordinary? After one meeting with this gentleman. And extraordinarily enough, he did come to Stanford, and I actually was able to develop a personal relationship with him. And I'm chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, actually. So it's been an interesting trajectory, isn't it?
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to touch on a big subject in the couple of minutes we've got left. You mentioned a neural basis for compassion. There's a theory that goes around that says law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, compassion is some kind of byproduct. You can have a luxury you can have at the end of the day once you've fed yourself enough. Is there anything that's true in that, or is there something rooted in the caveman brain that we have that is you could identify neurologically as a kind of center for compassion? Is it something we've needed to have?
Well, I don't think there's any question that this is an absolute requirement. The cost of us having the ability to abstract think, the ability to have complex language, the ability, if you will, to have theory of mind, recognize that other people are thinking things about us and vice versa, has come at a cost, and that cost is a long gestational period and the requirement that we're cared for and nurtured at birth. And that has stuck with us. It stuck with us through the evolutionary development of hunter-gatherers, and it's stuck with us now. And the fact of the matter is how we thrive when we are in community, when we are cared for, and when we care for others. And in fact, there is an ever-increasing body of evidence that shows with intent, you can boost your immune system, you can profoundly have an effect on your stress hormones in terms of decreasing them, you can downregulate your sympathetic nervous system, which in our modern society is out of whack compared to its useful function when we were doing flight or fight to survive. And in fact, it has an effect on longevity. And so we're finding more and more evidence that with intent, in terms of being compassionate and caring for others, it has a huge, huge impact on our health. And so when we talk about these centers, what's interesting is there are certain parts of the brain, one being the caudate and the nucleus accumbens, that they light up, if you will, or increase their metabolic state in certain circumstances. Now, ones that are well described from our caveman period is sex and food. Another translation of that is with money, but amazingly, and just as powerfully, if not more powerfully, is compassion and caring for others. And you can train this, actually. You can actually train your brain to be more compassionate and enrich your life, fulfill your life, and I think give you this transcendence that we all want.
There's a whole lot of information about the work the Centre does on the website. We haven't had time to go into in great detail, but ladies and gentlemen, please thank James R. Doty. Thank you. Thank you.